Four Kings is a very polarizing hack. When I was talking to people on my Discord about it, I got varying opinions, from someone who said that they quit on Chapter 1 because they absolutely hated every design decision, to someone who said that it was their favorite ROM hack of all time. And while these are obviously the most extreme examples, Four Kings is a very love it or hate it hack, and it's pretty easy to tell if you are going to love it or hate it from pretty early on. As such, I want to let you know very early on that I fall on the love it side of this dichotomy. I have some issues with few design decisions, but overall, I found the gameplay incredibly tight and satisfying, to the point that I ended up staying up until 5 in the morning one night playing it, and if that's not an endorsement, I don't know what is. That being said, this is definitely not the ROM hack for everyone, and so I'm going to do my best to explain why I enjoyed the areas that I did, the issues that I had, as well as what type of person I think would enjoy this sort of ROM hack. As usual, I am going to be dividing this review into sections, the first of which will focus on the gameplay, and the second and third will go into different aspects of the story that I feel warrant their own sections. Without any further ado, let's dive in. Part 1. The gameplay. Though the Four Kings is not a gimmick hack, it does have two central gimmicks that serve as its primary selling points. The first of which is the personal weapon system. Every single unit in the game has a personal weapon that they join with, and a few of them get second personal weapons through story events or secret conversations. Now, I've talked on the channel before about how much I love personal skills, as they can help differentiate similar units and give them different niches from each other. It's tempting to look at these personal weapons as being simply personal skills with durability attached to them. However, the design space used to make these personal weapons unique is really broad and results in the units feeling much more distinct from each other than units typically do based on purely personal skills. For example, fairly early on you get access to Sean the Sword Cavalier and Bradley the Lance Cavalier. Sean's personal weapon is the Quick Blade, which is a brave weapon meant for securing kills, especially against enemies with low defense. On the other hand, Bradley has the Sonyan, which is a 2-3 range lance that is ideal for chipping enemies without counter, but can't counter at 1 range, and so it leaves him vulnerable unless you trade it off of him. Immediately these two feel distinct from each other. Bradley is able to safely attack 1-2 range enemies without retaliation, as well as easily set up kills for your other units. Meanwhile, Sean is very easily able to take kills, but if there are high defense enemies, he will struggle to hit them with his personal weapon. To my mind, this is a lot more impactful than the difference between Kaze and Saizo having Miraculous Save versus the Pyromaniac thing. Now, the personal weapons aren't the only things that distinguish the Cavaliers from each other. Sean is faster but frailer, Bradley tends to be bulkier but he has no resistance, whereas Sean does have resistance and actually has a magic stat so he can make use of Lightbrand as well. But the personal weapons immediately give them a sense of identity, and I really like that. It is also worth noting that for many characters who have more situational personal weapons, the map that they join on does a good job of tutorializing ways in which you can make use of their personal weapons that might not be immediately obvious. For example, in the first map where you have access to Marcy, the Pegasus Knight, there is an extremely threatening bolting mage who can one-shot or nearly one-shot all of your units on hard mode. However, Marcy's personal weapon gives her an absurd amount of resistance and is effective against mages, so she's able to fly in and kill him in order to clear the way for the rest of your troops. That map also gives you a recruitable Myrmidon, whose personal sword gives him plus 100 avoid but prevents him from being able to crit and has very low might. There is a side objective on the map that involves running down a narrow hallway full of Brave Bow users, meant to tutorialize you in the fact that this weapon is not meant to be used offensively but instead defensively, and ideally you want him to face off against enemies that he can't counter so that he keeps them busy without wearing down durability of his weapon. Now, not every personal weapon is created equal, and there are a few that definitely feel disappointing, but for the most part this system succeeds in making everyone feel unique and makes you want to use everyone in your army. In other Fire Emblems, you might have to make the difficult decision of deciding which of these cool units you're going to use and which one you're going to bench. But Four Kings' other central gimmick allows you to actually train everyone in your army, and that is the route split. You see, for plot reasons, after Chapter 10 your two lords go separate ways and are engaging in different objectives. Half of your army goes with Walter and half of your army goes with Lionel. From there, you will alternate between maps where you control Walter's army and maps where you control Lionel's army. It's similar to the Holmes-Renan split if you've played Tearing Saga, although you don't get to choose who goes with each army. The units in each army are predetermined, so I guess it's closer to Shadows of Valentia or Gaiden. During the route split, you have enough deployment slots for every single unit you've recruited. This means you can make use of all of them and get a feel of how their personal weapons impact things. You also get a good deal of mid-game new recruits for each army, so if you were only training people in Walter's army, Lionel isn't completely out of luck, or vice versa. Then, in Chapter 21, the two armies merge, and you get to pick a squad of your favorites to tackle the endgame with. I really like this decision, as it allows almost every member of the cast to have some time in the spotlight during a single playthrough. Chapter 10 is early enough that units coming off the bench will be able to bounce back and contribute pretty quickly, if not immediately, and if there's a unit you don't plan on using long term, you can aggressively burn through uses of their personal weapon during the route split since you have to deploy them anyway, so you might as well make full use of them. One side effect of this route split is almost all of your units end up getting trained, but thankfully there's more than enough promotion items to go around. There are enough class-based promotion items to promote every single unit you get. Additionally, you get 2 Master Seals, which you can use if you miss a side objective for a Knight's Crest or a Hero Crest. For example, I missed one of the Knight's Crests on a map that I found particularly challenging, so I used a Master Seal to promote my final Cavalier. In addition to all of these promotion items, there are buyable Master Seals fairly early on. They're quite pricey, but if you want to, you can promote as early as Chapter 5, and then have a major power spike in the early game to help ease the difficulty. And on the topic of purchasing Master Seals, now's about as good a time as any to talk about the interlude maps. There are 3 in total, and these are the majority of the ways that you're going to be purchasing items. There are a few shops available on actual chapter maps, but for the most part you will be doing your shopping in the interlude maps. These are similar to the Battle Preparations map from Fire Emblem 7. You have 5 turns to go shopping, and there's also an arena if you want to raise money. And you probably do want to go into the arena to raise money, as the economy in this game is pretty tight. You do get a decent supply of gold, especially if you're getting side objectives such as treasure chests and stealables, but there's a lot of expensive weapons you might want access to, such as short bows, which are now Brave, early Master Seals, secret books, and goddess icons to patch up units' hits, and eventually buyable magical swords and buyable Brave weapons. Full disclosure, I used save states for the arena in these maps because the economy seems balanced around you going to the arena 5 times per map. There's even a little cutscene where Walter talks about going to the arena to make money to buy supplies, so it feels like it is intended, and I really couldn't be bothered. That's the only instance where I personally found it necessary to use save states, although the topic of save states does dovetail nicely into the extreme difficulty of this hack, because this is a very difficult hack. The hack's creator, Crash Boombang, describes this as very close to FE6 hard mode difficulty, but I personally found it to be a lot more difficult than FE6 hard mode. Enemies are incredibly threatening. They have inflated stats both in comparison to standard GBA and also in comparison to your units. Additionally, they tend to be kitted out with extremely powerful weapons. As early as Chapter 3, you will face generic units with silver weapons. Most of the cast is weak enough to get one-rounded by them, however you have the tools to succeed. In that same chapter you get handed 3 mages, one of which is the bulkiest unit in the early game. You additionally have an archer who has a very powerful magical bow, and a healer with access to a sleep staff that has 100% hit. You are definitely at a significant disadvantage in comparison to the enemy army, and will be for the majority of the game, but it's not an impossible task. Success lies in leveraging the tools that you have in order to quickly move through the map. And yes, it is important to move through those maps quickly because almost every map has incredibly tight anti-turtle incentives. It starts out relatively tame with villages that are going to be burned down, but Chapter 4 introduces what I like to call GTFO reinforcements. They are level 15 promoted heroes with ruin swords, nearly cap stats, and you have no hope of fighting them. They also have Void Curse, so you can't even use some sort of exploit in order to take advantage of them and gain experience. GTFO reinforcements aren't in every map, but they are in a large number of them. However, Four Kings is very good about communicating any time-based pressure. In a page taken out of Berwick Saga, cutscenes will play at the beginning of the map where someone talks about how, oh, our reinforcements are going to show up in 8 minutes, or we're about 10 days ahead of the people who are chasing us. The numbers will appear in red text, and that is an indication that you need to get out of there by whatever turn is indicated. These turn limits feel really well tested and fine-tuned. I am not known to be the fastest player in Fire Emblem. However, I always felt like the turn limits were attainable, but difficult. And that really feels like the sweet spot. There were definitely some maps where I just got away by the skin of my teeth, and it was incredibly satisfying to pull off rescue strats in order to get to the objectives just on time. Of course, tight deadlines don't mean anything if the level's not fun to play on its own, but thankfully 4 Kings has some of the most tightly designed maps I've seen in a while. Most maps want you to divide your army to an extent. Usually there's a recruitable character or droppable item, but sometimes you actually have to divide and conquer to accomplish tasks. For example, there are multiple maps where there are 2 seize points and the time limit is too strict to get them both with one lord, so you have to send 2 different squads to different areas. Enemy ranges often overlap to the extent that you require careful positioning to make sure you don't die on enemy phase. Or you could try for a hyper offense on player phase, but you need to make sure you're absolutely confident you can kill everyone, otherwise a failed offensive can result in a pretty high death toll and as a result, likely a reset. There are maps with standard objectives like seize, rout, and kill boss, but there are also several escape all maps, which tend to be my favorite of the bunch. Of particular note is an early game prison break map clearly inspired by Fire Emblem 5, where one of the lords and 2 thieves start at the entrance to a prison, and must go deeper and deeper in, unlocking every cell along the way to rescue all of the other recruited characters. Once they unlock the final cell, reinforcements spawn, and it's time to retreat back to the beginning of the map and escape before they catch you. There is some challenging combat on the map, but it is primarily a positioning-based map and really rewards a mastery over rescue drops due to the fact that it is also on a tight turn crunch. Between spreading your thieves out to make sure you get every cell, breaking a wall for a faster escape point, fighting an optional swordmaster for a stealable stat booster, and getting a treasure chest located on the opposite side of the prison from your units, there's a lot going on and not much time to do it, so you really feel rewarded if you're able to get all of these side objectives. This map is followed by a desert escape map, which is another favorite of mine, and then Chapter 10, which is probably the best map in 4 Kings and possibly the best map I've played in any ROM hack. It's a combination of kill boss and defend map. There are 4 bosses on the map, 1 in each corner, so you need to spread your forces out in order to get to them before the turn limit. However, you can't neglect the backlines, as the center of the map is a full line of seize points that the enemies can seize in order to give you game over. There are a few green units who will hold them off a little bit, but if you neglect them entirely, you will lose the map as a result. This on its own is cool enough, but what really makes it epic is the sheer scale of it. You have enough deployment slots for every unit you've recruited up to that point, and the 2 new units who join on that map. However, your army is divided in half. The middle of the map is the seize points, but it's also a giant gap where none of your units can cross, not even flyers. As a result, you need to divide your army in half to figure out which units work best together and which ones are best suited for the various bosses, as you are unable to switch places after you've killed the bosses or taken care of whatever enemies you wanted. It's really cool, has very interesting preps, and really rewards tactical on-your-feet thinking. It's honestly unlike anything I've seen in Fire Emblem so far. You really feel like you're fighting a war on 2 fronts and actively on the offense and defense at the same time. It's incredible how well they managed this. Even if you're turned off by the hack's difficulty, I recommend at the very least turning it down to easy so you can see this chapter in action because it is a thing of beauty. I like most of the other maps in the game as well, but I don't want to go super into them because I would like to leave a few surprises for people who haven't played the game yet. That said, there are a few aspects of the game and map design I'm not a huge fan of. The first is that hit rates can be unreliable. 4 Kings is definitely a stat inflation hack, but it uses the vanilla GBA award formula, and as a result, enemies having much higher speed than you would expect leads to them having much higher avoid than you would expect, and arguably much higher avoid than is reasonable. From a game that expects you to kill strong enemies and move really fastly, it can be frustrating if your only strategy is relying on multiple 70 and 80% because you can't afford to turtle and you can't afford to miss. In fairness, there are several solutions that Crash put in the game to try to solve this problem. The first is the one that I like the most, and that is the introduction of the FE11, FE12 save point system. This means that partway through a map, you can save if your strategy relies on multiple 80% hitting, and then if you miss, you can just reroll the RNG upon loading that save. Please note that the introduction of these save points does mean that the suspend feature no longer works, so if you do need to leave for whatever reason, just make a save state instead of a suspend. This solution serves to alleviate the frustration of resetting an entire map based on a late game unlucky miss, but it doesn't solve the core problem of low hit rates in a game that wants you to move fast. The other two try to address this, but I think they ultimately fail to an extent. The first is that most characters' personal weapons have extremely high hit, and if it's a character who you're not planning on using long term, you can use their personal weapon to patch up their accuracy and then bench them when it breaks. This is mostly fine, although it does make the few characters whose personal weapons have bad hit feel extraordinarily bad. Ron has a very bad skill stat, and his personal weapon doesn't have particularly good hit either, so he ends up feeling like one of the worst units in the game. This solution also doesn't help units who you want to use long term, as presumably you would like their personal weapons for the late game as well. And there are a few units whose personal weapons don't benefit from this at all, such as the unit who has a 10-use Siege Tome as his personal weapon, or the various units who have staves as their personals. The second and more direct solution is to make goddess icons and secret books buyable in the shops of the intermission chapters as well as the Preps Armory. This means that if you so desire, you can exchange gold for reliability. I like this in theory, however in practice it feels like most units are facing suboptimal hit rates, and I don't want to wreck my economy just to not deal with that. This is especially the case because it feels as though outside of the secret books and goddess icons, the economy is already very interesting and tight. When there are things like early master seals or buyable brave weapons, I don't want to spend a ton of gold on hit rates that I feel like I should already have by default. The other major criticism I have is a lack of enemy weapon variety. This is particularly notable in the endgame when every enemy simply has brave weapons of their particular class weapon type. However, even in the mid-game, most units only have silver weapons or a high rank throwable such as a tomahawk or a spear. This lack of variety meant that at a glance I could usually tell what weapon an enemy had. Are they a general? They've usually got a silver lance. Are they a nomad? They've usually got a short bow, which is brave. Are they a mage? Then they usually have whatever the highest tier of magic available is. This does theoretically make planning my moves faster, however in reality it often just ends up making the army very homogeneous, and makes most strategies just be kill them with strong weapon or use high defense on strong weapon. Adding in things like reavers, longbows, horse slayers, or worm slayers could make it so that one unit has a tough time engaging one group of enemies, but an easier time engaging another. But instead it turns out that most enemies are just tackled equally well by every unit. It's clear the intent was to make the enemies tougher, as having high tier weapons on everyone does make things tougher, however it also makes things samey, and when the enemy is samey, ironically, they can be easier to deal with because you just utilize the same strategy for every single group. It is, however, unironically hilarious that every single stationary general after the route split has an inventory consisting of Brave Sword, Brave Lance, Brave Axe, Brave Bow. Absolutely hilarious. I love that. Keep it, no notes. Perfect loadout. Those minor quibbles aside, this is still some of the best Fire Emblem I've ever played. And if all you care about is gameplay, I would absolutely recommend you check out Four Kings. However, this is where my praise needs to stop as we're moving into the story section and, well, to say that I wasn't a fan of the story might be understating it a little bit. Part 2. The story. I didn't really care for the story of Four Kings. Because this section is going to be pretty negative, I figured I would begin with some of the positive aspects of the story, because they are there. First is the setting. The geography and history of Ibril is really fleshed out, and it feels like a lived-in world, even more so than a lot of the mainline Fire Emblem worlds do. By pulling up a map every chapter, the game not only gives you a feel of the character's place in the world, but also the history around them and the various relationships between the kingdoms. Speaking of the relationship between the kingdoms, the game begins with a diplomatic mission between Askia and Benizin. It's firmly established that despite the country's strained relationship, they have more in common with each other than it would appear, and throughout the course of the plot, they end up needing to rely on each other in order to extinguish a greater threat. This cleanly mirrors the relationship between the two main lords, Walter and Lionel, who are constantly at each other's neck, but must learn to work together and love each other in order to overcome their foes. It's a well-done parallel and definitely adds to the theming of the story. The last very positive note that I have is that the cast is pretty diverse, including a large number of people of color, as well as a bunch of queer people, including one of the few trans characters I've seen in Fire Emblem hacks. In a series that is seemingly overflowing with straight white men, I appreciate that Four Kings bucks this trend in order to include an army that reflects the diversity of humans. It's unfortunate then that I have to start my criticism by saying I don't actually like any of the characters. Secondary cast almost exclusively includes one-note gimmick characters. Shelby is a loner and is constantly spouting variations of leave me alone. Yuffin is a murderer and is constantly talking about wanting to kill all the bad guys. Bradley won't stop talking about knightly honor. Every other line from Ron is questioning whether people can see through his act, and Nicole is constantly making sexual innuendos because she is obsessed with sex. Many characters also share gimmicks with each other. For example, both Dorian and Regis are defined by their alcoholism, whereas Celio and Ron are both lying about their skill. This shallow level of characterization is something that's present in many Fire Emblem games, and I don't think it's a huge issue. It's disappointing that the secondary cast isn't super fleshed out, but honestly, for a one-man project, it is understandable. Every member of the cast has multiple fully written supports and paired endings, so it's a lot of work to take on, and simplifying it by making the secondary characters all one note is a completely understandable solution to reduce the workload. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed by it, but also I think it is in the grand scheme of things fine. After all, the crux of the story is going to revolve around the primary cast. Unfortunately, I think I actually like the primary cast less than the secondary cast. After all, while they are mostly gimmick characters, there is some fun to be had in how their gimmicks interact. For example, Yuffin is offering to kill whoever is bothering Shelby, and then Shelby reveals that it is Yuffin who is bothering him. Or Bradley offering to tutor Emily, with Emily rejecting him and saying that she thinks his form is worse than her grandfather's, which eventually results in Bradley asking Emily, the child, to tutor him in how to be a knight. There are no such fun interactions to be found from the primary cast, and when they are talking to each other, I find myself just begging for the end of the conversation. This is because, without exception, every single member of the primary cast is an insufferable asshole. They're all just kind of dicks to each other and everyone around them. The story begins with Walter throwing a temper tantrum at 20 mercenaries, causing them to leave him and have to be re-recruited in the following chapters. On its own, I don't actually hate this idea. It gives you a preview of a bunch of recruitable characters early on in the campaign, and shows Walter overcoming his character flaw and learning and self-growth and all that fun stuff. However, Walter's character growth seems shallow, unearned, and inconsistent. You'll have a recruitment conversation where he tells the recruitable characters, "I'm sorry I blew up at you, we do actually need your help," followed by a conversation where he and Lionel yell at each other and are just kind of rude for no reason. As such, what is supposed to be a plotline about Walter learning to depend on other people instead has me questioning why any of these mercenaries would tolerate him for more than 30 seconds. In fact, it's firmly established that all of them get to keep their money even if they leave the party, so why aren't they leaving? It's certainly not because of their other leader, Lionel, because while he is presented as being the more reasonable, politically savvy one, whereas Walter is the hothead, Lionel is every bit as much a dick as Walter is. There are several instances early on where Lionel's desire to approach a situation with diplomacy is contrasted with Walter's eagerness for a fight. Each of these situations does end up resulting in a fight, because this is a video game and there needs to be conflict. However, despite this, Lionel is constantly insulting Walter, calling him a meathead, stupid, stuff like that. This even extends to Lionel criticizing Walter for sparring with one of the new recruits for fun. This is never presented as a positive thing, and I think Lionel is supposed to have the character flaw of being too harsh on his brother. On its own, I kind of like it. He's supposed to be the politically knowledgeable one, however, he constantly undermines this by being a dick to his brother in situations where it would be considered inappropriate. This is actually an inciting incident in the mid-game, causing them to lose face in front of another world leader. The reason that this doesn't work for me, however, is that Lionel being a dick to Walter does not exist in a vacuum. Almost every other interaction between main characters involves one of them being an asshole to another for seemingly no reason. Zachary and Ava are talking over the Sending Stones, and Zachary just begins insulting her for no reason. Landon publicly humiliates an enthusiastic Walter in some sort of weird he needs to grow through humiliation thing. When Lionel expresses insecurity in his leadership skills, Zachary just insults him. And throughout Ava and Walter's chemistry-deprived romance, Ava is constantly passive-aggressive to him, as well as passive-aggressive to Lionel, for seemingly no reason. I could go on with more examples, but I think I've made my point. The characters are just so mean to each other that it makes me think they can't possibly like each other. In contrast to FE7's main lords, who sometimes bicker but seem to actually care about each other, the lords of Four Kings seem to actively fucking hate each other. And as a result, it's very hard to like any of them, because it doesn't feel like I'm hanging out with a group of friends, it feels like I'm hanging out with some coworkers that just can't stand each other. And if I wanted that, I would take back my old job at Walmart. Suffice to say, I'm not really a fan of any of the characters. But even if I were, I don't think the story around them is constructed particularly well. I'm going to give a basic plot synopsis, avoiding major spoilers, but if you want to go in completely blind, this is your warning to click away. The central conflict involves two simultaneous rebellions in Askia and Benzian, ousting the rulers of those nations. Despite being unrelated, they are suspiciously coordinated with each other, and seemingly supplied by some sort of hidden puppet master. The plot involves our heroes putting down the two rebellions and finding out who is pulling their strings, and ultimately defeating them and ending their plan for world domination. It's a fairly simple plot, but I don't think there's anything wrong with a simple plot, and aspects of it tie in well with the two central themes, that being the brothers' relationship and nobility ignoring the plight of the common man. However, my biggest issue with the plot overall is the bizarre pacing it has. Chapter 1 has Walter and Lionel run across the beginnings of the Askian Rebellion. They end up having to violently put them down, and Lionel talks about how he's worried that this might mean that there's another larger rebellion brewing. This is then dropped so that we can fight bandits for 6 maps in a row. 2 of these bandit fights are devoted to beginning a romance subplot that I'll talk about later, but the rest of them are just filler, really. Chapter 8 is where we encounter the Benizin Rebellion, and it is probably the high point of the story gameplay integration, with an excellent prison escape map, followed by Chapter 9, which is another escape map running across the desert, and Chapter 10, which is my favorite map in the game. The mid-game is a perfectly serviceable stretch of fighting the 2 rebellions and alternating between Walter and Lionel's army. I don't really have any complaints here, other than the fact that there's a Camus whose motivation feels kind of flat, although, to be fair, that is standard for most Fire Emblem Camus. My biggest issue is that he's presented as being unwaveringly loyal to his country, however, he's fighting for the rebellion against his country's king, so I don't really understand why we had to kill him, especially since he expresses on multiple occasions that the rebellion's leader is pretty immoral and that he fundamentally disagrees with him. It kind of just feels like Crash thought it would be sad if Ian had to kill his boyfriend and didn't really expand upon their motivations. Overall, however, the mid-game is solid, and I think this is definitely the strongest point in the story. Then we move into the endgame, and the pacing issues prop up their pesky heads again. We spend the first 2 chapters rushing to our home base in order to try to discover who the puppet master behind the rebellions is. This is revealed along with a major lore dump that affects multiple characters' place in the world and story. However, immediately after that, and I wish I was joking, is a fight against generic bandits. We are 5 chapters from the end of the game, and just had the main antagonist revealed, as well as learned what his plan to take over the world is and what his motivations are, only to have everything come to a grinding halt so that we can fight some generic bandits. That way we can make some cheap jokes about how Ava's dad doesn't want her to fuck. It's kind of just mind-boggling. We have another Camus fight after that, and this one's motivations feel even worse. It almost feels like a parody of Camus, as one of our main lords explains that the Camus is being manipulated by the antagonist, and he responds by saying, "Well, I guess you're my enemy then." And it's really weird. I don't have any issues with the rest of the ending. Villains get appropriate comeuppance, and there is a suitably epic final battle in a city. However, I was so checked out by the end of the story due to all of the pacing problems and frustrating dialogue and dealing with characters who I found insufferable that it really felt hard for me to appreciate the climax. The brothers rekindling their relationship didn't really work for me either. Throughout the portion of time where they're separate, Walter and Lionel made a couple of mistakes, and each of them said, "Oh, I wouldn't have made this mistake if the other one were here." But I just don't believe that. Like, Walter accidentally gets 2 of his ships stolen from him, but if Lionel were there, the ships would get stolen and then Lionel would just call Walter an idiot for losing them. Likewise, Lionel is just constantly insecure and doesn't really seem to make any mistakes that Walter's hot-headedness would have solved. His biggest failing is that he's unable to successfully negotiate with the rebellion leader, and Walter has not shown himself as being particularly good at negotiating, so if he were there, I think things would have just gone worse. Overall, neither the plot about squashing rebellions nor about the brothers rekindling their strained relationship work for me. There is a third major plot, and that is the romance between Walter and Ava. However, discussing this will bring us into the third and final section. Part 3. Uncomfortable Portions. In Chapter 2 of The Four Kings, Walter and Lionel take Ava, aka the Beautiful Bandit, hostage. Almost immediately after being their hostage, Ava falls in love with Walter. This isn't portrayed as some sort of Stockholm Syndrome thing, and Ava is still kind of technically there against her will, but she is immediately smitten by Walter and they begin a slow, chemistry-less romance. While Ava is allowed to fight with them, and eventually is no longer considered a hostage, they still begin their relationship under this really weird power dynamic where Walter is literally in control of whether or not Ava is in a cage. Not to kink shame anyone, but it is uncomfortable that their relationship is presented as wholesome when it begins under this kind of bizarre power dynamic. And unfortunately, it's not the only part of Four Kings' writing that makes me uncomfortable. There's a house early on where you get a joke about a peeping Tom who likes looking up Pegasus Knight's skirts. And this joke will repeat even if you visit the house with your underage Pegasus. The character Wilson is pretty clearly modeled after Indigenous Americans, which is why it's kind of uncomfortable that he comes off as naive and also has the ability to speak to bugs. In Zoe's sea support with Vin, he's constantly following her around and harassing her despite her continuously telling him to leave her alone. However, once he's gone, she mentions that she misses him and actually does kind of like him being there. While the trans character Harriet refers to herself as a woman who was constantly told that she's a man, the other characters who are supposedly trans allies refer to her as both a man who became a woman and something in between a man and a woman. Not only does she not offer any pushback on this, but this is actually the lead up to one of her romantic paired endings. Additionally, her two character gimmicks are that she is hot-headed and pushy, both of which are trans misogynistic stereotypes about how trans women behave. Marvin is an overbearing father, and it is played for laughs that he wants to control his daughter's sex life, despite the fact that his daughter is an adult and getting married to one of the other main characters. I want to be clear. I don't think that Crash Boom Bang is misogynistic or racist or transphobic for including these sections in the game. However, I do think that these sections of the game are definitely misogynistic, racist, and transphobic. They strike me as the results of a desire to include an incredibly diverse cast without necessarily consulting people from the identities that are being represented in the game. For example, I think that if an Indigenous person looked at Wilson's supports, they would criticize it on the grounds that it feels like a noble savage caricature. Likewise, as a trans woman myself, I can see that the intent behind Harriet is a positive one. However, the language around her gender identity and the character traits that she is given instead end up creating a caricature of a trans woman. One of the principles I have when talking about these things is that saying or doing something offensive doesn't make you a bad person on itself. Instead, what determines that is how you respond to criticism. After all, we are all unfortunately raised in a society that normalizes sexist, racist, and queerphobic thoughts in us, and there are plenty of internalized beliefs that I, you, and everyone else has. For example, the peeping Tom joke is reflective of the sort of thing that's present in all sorts of early 2000s comedies, and was normalized to me as a child. Of course, in reality, it's joking about a consent violation and not funny at all. My hope in bringing up these areas of discomfort is twofold. One, to warn any potential viewers if it's something that could trigger you to potentially avoid it, either skip the story or skip the hack. The other, however, is that if Crash watches this video, I do not wish to shame him or make him feel that he is a bad person for including those jokes, but to draw attention to the ways in which they are offensive and hope that they will not be included in future works. Because I firmly believe that these sorts of mistakes are not indicative of any sort of character or moral failings, but instead an opportunity for learning and growing. With that segment out of the way, I want to move on to my concluding thoughts. Part 4. Conclusion and Recommendation. Four Kings is a hack of extremes. I love most aspects of the gameplay, but hate most aspects of the story. As such, first and foremost, I would recommend this hack to people whose primary concern is the gameplay over the story. However, that is not the only caveat I would give. If you are not comfortable playing fast, this hack is not for you, as it demands speed. You don't have to be an LTCer by any stretch of the imagination. After all, I was able to beat it on the hardest difficulty setting, but you do need to be comfortable not turtling. Most maps set strict deadlines, but thankfully the game communicates those to you very effectively. If you are seeking a challenge, I definitely recommend tackling this on its highest difficulty, which is listed as the intended experience. However, if you just want to check out the cool personal weapons and don't especially feel like dealing with hard enemies, then perhaps playing on normal or easy would be more your pace, or watching a let's play, because there are plenty online. At the end of the day, I would definitely give this hack a high recommendation, but not for story-focused or more casual players. It is also worth noting that due to the nature of the route split and the individual roles that characters fill thanks to their personal weapons, this is not an especially Iron Man friendly game, so if you are the sort of Fire Emblem player who Iron Mans everything, this one is probably not for you as well. Despite the rather mixed review, I really enjoyed this game, and I probably wouldn't have checked it out if the patrons hadn't voted for it to be the next Romhack reviews. As a result, I would like to thank my patrons, not only for voting for a very good ROM hack, but also for your continued financial support. Special thanks to my pre-promote tier, which contains Thick Molder, Marin Karen, and Jamie Collins. Okay, quick addition because I got one more patron after I finished recording, but while I was in the editing process, so thank you George Grenville, the 7th PM. I really appreciate the support. This is the tier that allows you to vote on future videos. However, if that's too pricey for you, there is a lower tier growth units that gives you access to sneak previews and cat pictures. The link is below if you're interested in checking that out, as well as a link to my Discord server, the Boars Appreciation Station. We talk about ROM hacks and all sorts of other fun things there, so if you're interested in joining the community, go ahead and click down below. We'd love to have you. While you're there, liking and commenting really help the video out in the algorithm, and regardless of what you choose to do, have a wonderful day, gamers.